There's a country on the western edge of the Balkans that most people cannot find on a map without stopping to think. It has a coastline on the Adriatic Sea, a population smaller than many individual cities, and a language so unlike anything around it that linguists spent 2 full centuries trying to figure out where it came from. The country is Albania, and for a very long time, nobody could say with any scientific certainty who Albanians actually were, where they originally came from, or how they managed to survive as a distinct people through 5 centuries of Ottoman rule, multiple waves of conquest, and some of the most violent political upheaval Europe has seen in the modern era. Then ancient DNA changed everything. Researchers extracted genetic material from bones thousands of years old, compared it against the DNA of living Albanians today, and found something that no written history had been able to confirm. What the science revealed was not a simple migration story. It was not a medieval arrival. It was something far older, far more continuous, and far more remarkable than anything the history books had managed to produce. In this video, we are going to walk through the full genetic origin story of the Albanian people. We will cover where Albanians live today and why their diaspora is one of the most striking in the entire world. We will look at the linguistic puzzle that baffled scholars for generations, the fierce historical debate between competing theories of origin, and then we will bring in the DNA, actual ancient genetic data from studies published in peer-reviewed journals, including a landmark paper that appeared in Nature Human Behavior in 2026. By the end of this video, you will understand why Albanian DNA carries a secret that only modern science was finally able to expose. Stay with me until the end. The full story is worth every minute. Here's a number that catches most people completely off guard the first time they hear it. According to the most recent available data, there are somewhere between 7 and 10 million Albanians in the world, but only about 2.4 million of them actually live inside Albania itself. Think about what that means. More Albanians are living outside their home country than inside it. The majority of an entire people is scattered across the globe, maintaining language, faith, cultural memory, and identity far away from the place that carries their name. By any measure of diaspora size relative to home population, this is one of the most dramatic dispersal stories in the world. You will find significant Albanian communities across Italy, Germany, Switzerland, Greece, Turkey, Sweden, the United Kingdom, the United States, and Australia. In Kosovo, a territory with its own deeply complicated political history, over 90% of the population is ethnically Albanian. That is not a minority clinging to its heritage in someone else's country. That is a dominant population in a contested and internationally recognized territory, which tells you something important about the reach, the resilience, and the depth of Albanian identity as a living force in the modern world. When scientists began investigating the genetic origins of Albanians, they were not looking at a small, isolated pocket of people hidden away from history. They were studying one of Europe's most geographically widespread and historically persistent peoples, a people who had absorbed the Ottoman Empire's 5-century presence without losing their language, a people who had survived invasion after invasion without being genetically replaced. Understanding how that happened, both biologically and culturally, is exactly what this video is built around. To appreciate why Albanian survival is so remarkable, you first need to understand the geography and history that surrounded them. The Balkans is not just a region on a map. It is one of the most contested, carved up, and repeatedly remade pieces of territory in all of recorded human history. Empires did not simply pass through the Balkans. They crashed into each other there and left permanent marks. Rome absorbed it. Byzantium held large portions of it for centuries. Beginning in the 6th and 7th centuries, Slavic groups migrated in from the north in large numbers and fundamentally reshaped the linguistic and genetic landscape of the entire peninsula. The Ottomans arrived in the 14th century and stayed for half a millennium. After them came nationalist movements, the Balkan Wars of the early 20th century, 2 world wars, and then the violent collapse of Yugoslavia in the 1990s. Every single chapter of that history displaced, converted, absorbed, or simply eliminated populations that had previously held territory for generations. In that environment, maintaining a distinct identity across thousands of years was not the default outcome. It was extraordinary. And here's the thing that the genetic record shows very clearly. Most populations in the Balkans carry genetic breaks, moments where major migration events significantly change the population's ancestry profile. The Slavic migrations alone left an unmistakable mark in the DNA of Greeks, Bulgarians, Serbians, and Macedonians. Their genomes tell the story of those arrivals layered on top of earlier populations. Albanians show some of those same outside influences, but only on top of something far older that never got replaced. The foundation held in a way that simply did not happen anywhere else on the peninsula. To understand why that is significant, you have to start with the language, because the linguistic mystery surrounding Albanian is one of the strangest puzzles in European scholarship. Consider how most European languages connect to each other. Spanish, French, Italian, and Romanian all descend from Latin. English and German share a Germanic ancestor. Polish and Russian are close relatives. Greek and Sanskrit share a root if you go back far enough into Indo-European prehistory. The entire Indo-European language family is a vast interconnected web, and almost every language in Europe sits somewhere inside it, with clear links to nearby relatives. Albanian belongs to that same Indo-European family, but it sits completely alone on its own branch. It has no close sister language, no near relative. Linguists classify it as an isolate within the broader family, meaning it diverged so early and so completely from everything else that no surviving language shares its immediate ancestry. That isolation is not just technically interesting for academics. It is one of the deepest unsolved questions in European linguistics, and it has direct implications for the origin debate. Here is where the mystery deepens further. Roughly half of all Albanian vocabulary consists of borrowed words pulled in from Latin, Greek, Turkish, and Slavic languages over centuries of contact. Every empire that moved through Albanian territory left words behind in the language, the way water leaves mineral deposits as it moves through rock. But the core grammar, the fundamental structure, and the oldest surviving vocabulary resisted every outside influence. They belonged to something ancient that was in place before any of those empires arrived. The oldest surviving written document in the Albanian language dates to 1462. A single page, a formula for baptism embedded in a letter written by the Archbishop of Durrës. One page. That is the entire written record for a language that millions of people were speaking across a significant stretch of the Balkans at that time. The reason for that silence in the written record is straightforward. Albanian speakers were predominantly rural mountain communities, shepherds and clan societies who had no relationship to the literate courts of Rome or Byzantium or the Slavic kingdoms. The language lived entirely in spoken form, passed mouth to mouth across generations without ever being written down. And that silence in the historical record is precisely why historians argued so intensely for so long about where Albanians actually came from. Without written records and without clear physical evidence linking modern Albanians directly to named ancient peoples, historians had to work with what they had: linguistics, archaeology, and substantial amounts of inference. For most of the 18th and 19th centuries, three main theories dominated the debate. Each had serious academic supporters. Each also had serious problems. The first and most widely supported theory today is that Albanians descend from the ancient Illyrians. The Illyrians were a collection of Indo-European tribes who dominated the Western Balkans from roughly 1200 BC onward. They controlled a substantial stretch of territory running from what is now Slovenia in the north down to the coast of what is now northern Greece in the south. They were known as fierce fighters and skilled sailors on the Adriatic. Several Roman emperors had Illyrian or Western Balkan provincial origins, most notably Diocletian, who built one of the most spectacular surviving palace complexes in the ancient world at what is now the city of Split in Croatia. When Rome absorbed Illyrian territories, the Illyrian language gradually disappeared from official records. By the 7th century, it had vanished from written history entirely. The theory is that it did not die. It simply evolved into what we now call Albanian. The second theory argued that Albanians did not descend from the Illyrians at all, but from the Thracians, an ancient people whose territory covered much of what is now Bulgaria and parts of northern Greece. Under this model, Albanians would have migrated westward into their current territory during the post-Roman period, arriving at roughly the same time as the Slavic migrations of the 6th and 7th centuries. This made them relative newcomers to the Western Balkans, rather than ancient inhabitants. The third position argued for a mixed origin, descendants of multiple ancient Balkan peoples, including both Illyrian and Thracian contributions. Intellectually honest in its acknowledgement of complexity, but frustratingly vague in its conclusions. Without hard evidence, it resolved nothing and satisfied no one completely. The debate needed something that documents and archaeology simply could not supply. Before we get to the DNA, something needs to be stated clearly, because the debate over Albanian origins was never purely an academic exercise. From the very beginning, the question of where Albanians came from carried enormous political weight, and that political weight shaped the debate in ways that had nothing at all to do with the evidence. If Albanians were Illyrian descendants, ancient and indigenous to the Western Balkans, then their presence in territories like Kosovo was not a medieval coincidence or an accident of late migration. It was the continuation of thousands of years of unbroken habitation. That argument carried enormous significance when Kosovo's status became one of the most explosive political questions in post-Cold War Europe. The Kosovo War of 1998 to 1999 and Kosovo's 2008 Declaration of Independence were both surrounded by competing historical claims about who was there first, who had the deeper roots, whose connection to the land was more legitimate and more ancient. On the other side, the Thracian migration theory, which placed Albanian origins further to the east and their arrival in the Western Balkans as late as the 6th or 7th century, was politically useful for those who wished to argue that Albanians were newcomers whose presence in Kosovo and other contested areas was no older than the Slavic arrivals of the same period. Science is indifferent to national narratives. DNA does not adjust its findings based on political convenience, but evidence produced in a debate this charged carries consequences that extend far beyond any laboratory. Understanding that the origin question had been politically loaded for 2 full centuries helps explain why the studies that finally produced clear genetic answers landed with such force. They were not simply answering a historical question. They were walking into a space that generations of scholars had been navigating with extreme care. The key research came in stages. A major preprint study from an international team including researchers at the University of Oxford, Harvard University, and the Broad Institute was published on the bioRxiv platform in June 2023, led by Dr. Leonidas Romanos Devranoglou. That work was subsequently developed and published in the peer-reviewed journal Nature Human Behavior in 2026. Scientists analyzed ancient DNA samples from archaeological sites across the Western Balkans, spanning thousands of years, alongside genetic data from present-day ethnic Albanians. The resulting dataset was one of the largest and most detailed ever assembled for a regional population genetics study in Europe. What they found settled the debate in a way that 2 centuries of historical argument had completely failed to accomplish. The first and most striking finding was genetic continuity. Albanians today carry a genetic signature that is directly traceable to the late Bronze Age and Iron Age populations of the Western Balkans, the very period when Illyrian culture dominated the region. That continuity is not a minor thread running faintly through Albanian DNA. It is the dominant and defining feature of their entire genetic profile. Dr. Davranoglu stated in connection with the research that Albanians represent one of the clearest examples of long-term genetic continuity anywhere in the Balkans. The neighboring populations, Bulgarians, Serbians, Croatians, Greeks, and Macedonians, all show clear genetic breaks in their DNA records, moments where large-scale migrations significantly altered the population's profile. Albanians show traces of those same outside influences, but they are layered on top of something far older that survived completely intact. When researchers mapped the actual genetic composition of modern Albanians, what emerged was a portrait built in 3 distinct layers. Each layer represents a different wave of human movement into the Balkans across thousands of years. Together, they tell the complete story of how Albanian DNA was assembled. The first and smallest layer is a modest Neolithic component, tracing back to the first agricultural communities that spread into Europe from Anatolia, modern Turkey, approximately 8,000 to 9,000 years ago. These were the people who introduced farming to the continent, gradually replacing the hunter-gatherer way of life that had dominated Europe since the Ice Age. In Albanian DNA, their contribution is real but modest, a signal from the deepest layer of European prehistory, faint but measurable. The second layer is where the story becomes genuinely remarkable. This component accounts for somewhere between 68 and 84% of Albanian ancestry, depending on the specific sample group examined. It is associated with Bronze Age and Iron Age populations of the Western Balkans, the Illyrians, and related groups who dominated this region for over 1,000 years. This is not a minor thread. It is the overwhelming core of Albanian genetic identity. No other Balkan population carries this ancient Western Balkan component at anywhere near this level. Surrounding populations that absorbed massive genetic contributions from Eastern European and Anatolian migrants during the migration period show between 40 and 86% Eastern European ancestry added during that era. Albanian ancestors absorbed considerably less, averaging only 10 to 20% from outside sources. It is what makes Albanian DNA genuinely distinct on the entire peninsula. The third layer accounts for approximately 10 to 20% of Albanian ancestry. It reflects the migrations of late antiquity and the early medieval period. Germanic groups, Gothic peoples, and Slavic communities who moved through the Balkans between the 4th and 9th centuries. Albanians absorbed some of this genetically, as any population living through that period of upheaval would inevitably do. But it did not reshape them. It did not overwrite the foundation that was already there. The ancient core held. And the Y chromosome evidence makes that foundation even clearer and more precise. The Y chromosome passes directly from father to son across generations with very little change. That makes it one of the most reliable tools population geneticists have for tracing direct paternal lineages across long stretches of time. When researchers examined the Y chromosomes of modern Albanian men, what they found was a direct biological bridge connecting the living to the ancient. The most common paternal lineage among Albanian men is called EIV13. It appears in roughly a third of all Albanian men and climbs to around 40% in Kosovo. This lineage is ancient in the Balkans. It is traceable through the archaeological record to the Bronze Age, and in some analyses, even further back. It did not arrive recently. It did not come in with Ottoman-era movements or medieval migrations. It was already embedded in the paternal lines of Balkan populations long before written history began recording names and borders. The second major paternal lineage is J2BL283, appearing in a substantial share of Albanian men. This is where the evidence becomes particularly striking. The lineage, J2BL283, carried by living Albanian men today, traces directly to Bronze Age burial sites excavated in northern Albania at locations including Shkrel and Kinnamec. When scientists examined Iron Age skeletal remains from Dalmatia and Slovenia, regions directly associated with Illyrian culture in the archaeological record, they found the same marker in ancient bones. The identical paternal lineage present in Iron Age Illyrian burials is still present in the bodies of men living in Albania and Kosovo today. What this Y chromosome data confirms is not ancestry in the vague or general sense. It confirms a direct paternal line of descent from the Iron Age populations of the Western Balkans to modern Albanian men. Not a statistical resemblance, not a cultural inheritance, a biological one, written into the most stable part of the human genome and preserved across more than 3,000 years. Now remember the Thracian migration theory, the one that argued Albanians were not indigenous to the Western Balkans at all, but had arrived from further east during the 6th or 7th century at roughly the same moment as the Slavic migrations. It was a theory with genuine academic supporters for most of the 20th century. The 2023 and 2026 studies did not leave it ambiguous. They buried it with data. There is no detectable genetic signal in modern Albanian DNA of a large-scale migration originating from Thracian territory during the post-Roman period. None whatsoever. Population migrations of that scale always leave a signature in the genome. The Bronze and Iron Age ancestry that dominates Albanian DNA was already present in the Western Balkans, continuously long before those centuries. The genetic record shows no break, no replacement, no sudden influx of Eastern ancestry at that time. The mountainous terrain of the Western Balkans appears to have functioned as a natural barrier, slowing the genetic replacement that reshaped every neighboring population during the same period. If you want the most vivid and concrete proof that Albanian identity is not a modern construction or a medieval accident, you do not need a laboratory. You need to visit a cluster of villages scattered across the hills of southern Italy. After the death of the Albanian national hero Gjergje Kastrioti Skanderbeg in 1468 and the Ottoman conquest that followed, tens of thousands of Albanians crossed the Adriatic and settled in communities across Sicily, Calabria, and Basilicata. They believed they were leaving temporarily. They packed their language, their form of Christian worship, and their customs, fully expecting to return home when the Ottoman tide eventually pulled back. It never did. More than 600 years later, those villages still exist. They are called the Arbereshe communities, and what has been preserved inside them is something that scholars genuinely struggle to find adequate words for. The people there still speak Albanian, but it is not modern Albanian. It is a medieval dialect so archaic that a contemporary speaker from Tirana would hear something closer to the language of 5 centuries ago than to anything spoken in Albania today. The dialect froze at the exact moment of departure and has been held in place in those Italian hills ever since, passed from parent to child across 600 years without a written standard, without government support, without any formal institution to protect it. Nothing but the act of speaking it kept it alive. Those communities still practice Byzantine Rite Christianity, the same form of worship their ancestors carried across the Adriatic. They still perform traditional dances and maintain cultural ceremonies that have in many cases disappeared from Albania itself. It is one of the most striking examples of cultural preservation anywhere in the modern world. And having understood the full story of Albanian origins, the genetics, the linguistic isolation, the Illyrian continuity running through the DNA, the survival of those mountain communities through empire after empire, you understand exactly what you're looking at in those Italian villages. It is what genuine long-term continuity looks like when it is stretched across 600 years of exile. Not a museum exhibit, a living reality. Albanians are not a medieval footnote. They are not a people who arrived late and filled a vacuum left by others. The science has now spoken on this with unusual precision and clarity, from the Bronze Age and Iron Age foundations embedded in their autosomal DNA, from the Y chromosome lineages that match directly to ancient Illyrian burial sites excavated by archaeologists, from the linguistic isolation that only makes sense if the language never moved very far from where it started, from the Arbereshe villages in southern Italy still speaking a dialect that froze in the 15th century. Every thread of evidence, every layer of the analysis points in the same direction. This is one of the oldest continuously present populations in Europe. A people who absorbed every empire that tried to replace them, outlasted every political force that tried to erase them, and arrived in the modern world carrying genetic and cultural memory that stretches back at least 3,000 years without a break. The DNA did not create that story. It confirmed what the language, the history, and the sheer undeniable fact of Albanian survival had always suggested to anyone who looked carefully enough and honestly enough at the evidence.